All right, hello everyone. We are going to discuss World War One, basically the during and the end. We're going to run through this as quickly as possible. We'll review a couple of things about the beginning of the war, but we have to really kind of move forward. So we know why the World War One begins. We know when it's going to happen. We know all of those things. We know what the long-term causes. We know about the spark that's going to ignite the war. What we're going to talk about today is the war itself, and we have to start off the war by discussing the technology that's involved in the war. All the technology that's listed here, the machine guns, the chemical weapons, the submarines, the U-boats rather, the airplanes, the tanks, are all going to make war more deadly, but it's also going to make it into a situation where war is going to become less personal. And that's a common trend of the 20th century. As we become more technologically advanced with warfare, and remember, this is all coming from the Industrial Revolution. As we become more technologically advanced with warfare, warfare becomes less personal. You think about how World War One goes, and we know about the technology that's used then. But then World War Two, we have the creation of the atom bomb, and then we have the Cold War with the creation of the nuclear missiles, and then we know that today we're using different types of technology where you might not ever see your enemy. So one of the common trends of the 20th century is that warfare becomes less and less personal. You might never see your enemy. Now, because of this new technology that's being used in the war, the new strategy that's going to be used, especially on the Western Front of the war, is going to be something called trench warfare. As you can see from this map, there are two sides of the war. There's the Western Front, which is on the French side, and then there's the Eastern Front, which is on the Russian side. Trench warfare was going to be the dominant strategy on the Western Front, and that's what we're going to be kind of talking about for a second here. Now, you learned about trench warfare in 8th grade, and all of those things, you need to remember it, but I want you to remember the brutality of it, right? Whether you're in the trenches or that area of no man's land, we know that there was a lot of death, there was a lot of destruction, there was a lot of disease. It was a terrible, terrible situation. These trenches were horrible places that soldiers had to stay in for months at a time. And what we saw was, because of the strategy and because of the technology that was being used during the warfare, there was a stalemate on the Western Front. What a stalemate basically means is that there was no movement on the front lines for a very long period of time, which means neither side could get the advantage. That was, again, a result of the technology and the strategies that were being used during the war. Now, because of that, during the war, there was a strong push to use the home front, right? The home front was using resources from home to help out with the war effort. This all revolves around the idea of what's called total war. Total war is when an entire nation's resources go towards a war effort. So that means things like what you learned about again in 8th grade. Women are going to be coming out in the factories and helping with making munitions. They're also going to be used to make clothing and other types of items that are going to be needed for the war effort. People are also going to donate anything they have. Chicken bones could be used as knives. They could use anything to help with making boots or whatever else. Everything from that nation's resources are going to go to the war effort. That is also why this is a global war, because what nations of Europe are going to do is they're going to depend on their colonies to help out with some of those resources. So that's why Australia is going to be involved. That's why the Americas are going to be involved, not as colonies, but the Americas are going to be involved in a second. But that's also why Africa and Asia and all of those areas are going to be involved. This is truly a global war for that reason. Now, the stalemate is going to go on for a long period of time, so all of these resources are going to be used over and over and over again. And this is going to be important because after the war, in areas like India are going to want, or they're going to have a want for independence. They're going to have a want for self-determination. And the Europeans are just not going to be ready, especially the British are not going to be willing to give it up yet. But that's something we're going to discuss later on. So we understand what total war is. We understand what the stalemate is. What I want to talk about now is how the war kind of comes to an end. There's a few significant things that I want you guys to kind of be aware of. There are two major turning points in the war that I want you to know. The first one was in 1917 when the United States gets involved in the war. You could see here, these are the different reasons why the United States gets in the war. It has to do with the Zimmerman telegram and the sinking of Lusitania. But the United States is going to come into the war, and they're going to really aid with the Western Front of the war, okay, which you can see again on this map. The other major turning point is going to involve the Russian Revolution of 1917, which we're going to get into next. The Russian Revolution we're going to get into the reasons for it, and we're going to go through the details. But what you need to know about in terms of World War One is that the Russians are going to leave World War One early. Vladimir Lenin, who is the leader of Russia at that point, is going to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Brest-Litovsk is an area of Poland, present-day Poland, which was an area where they signed this treaty. And basically, it was agreement between the Germans and the Russians for the Russians to leave the war effort early. The Russians gave up a large piece of land in order to do so. And it's going to really hurt them after the war, because one of the things that happens is when the peace treaties are signed after World War One, the Russians are going to lose a lot of territory, which is going to eventually become places like Poland and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, which are the Baltic states, which we're going to show you in a couple of minutes. So we can kind of get an idea of what's going to go on. When it's all said and done, World War One is going to be won by the Allies, which is, the British, the French, the Americans, and I guess you can consider the Italians. And at the end of the war, there's going to be some decisions that are going to have to be made. Those decisions are going to involve what happens at the end of the war. What do we do? So as you learned in 8th grade, the first idea that's going to be brought forth is going to be Wilson's 14 points. And here's a list of the different provisions of Wilson's 14 points. Essentially, what Wilson wants to do is he wants to prevent future wars. And he talks about this idea of war without victory. Do not punish your losers. Instead, let's figure out a way to prevent future wars. So he comes up with these 14 points, which really don't punish Germany at all for the war. And they kind of guarantee self-determination, which is independence for people. They get rid of the secret alliances. They talk about free trade. They talk about, getting rid of unrestricted submarine warfare, all those kind of things, right? To try to prevent future war. Disarmament. And it's a great idea. Looking back in history, everybody's like, wow, we should have totally done that, even if it wasn't enforceable. But when this is presented to the Allies, they basically laugh at Wilson, and they say this is a joke. Countries like Britain and France are so angry at the Germans that they say it's time for them to get punished. They were aggressors. They were to blame for the war, and they say we're not going to sign this. The only thing that comes from the war effort is that bottom 14 point, which is the League of Nations, which is a peacekeeping organization that was created by Wilson. Now, the League of Nations involved many countries of the world, but the one country that really doesn't get involved is the United States. And for that reason, in addition to others, the League of Nations is a failure. They're not able to keep the peace because they don't have any teeth. They're not strong enough to prevent future wars. But that is a provision of Wilson's 14 points that's going to be accepted. What is going to be accepted, you guys learned about a while ago, is the Treaty of Versailles, which is the Paris Peace Conferences. There's going to be other treaties that we're going to kind of look into that deal with World War One, but this is the big one. Obviously, what's going to happen with the Treaty of Versailles is they are going to punish Germany for the war. And they're going to do different things to them. They're going to lose territories. They're going to lose their colonies. They're going to have to demilitarize. They're going to have to pay war reparations. They're going to have to take blame for the war. Now, obviously, we know the irony of all this. Germany really was not to blame for the war, though they were an aggressive nation and though they were belligerent. We know the reality that, a lot of the nations could have stopped this war from happening from the beginning. But we got to punish the loser. We know the result of this, what it's going to be. This is going to make Germans very, very angry. And they're going to want revenge. And they're going to be willing to elect a fascist leader named Adolf Hitler to come in and take control over their nation. And then we know World War II is coming from there. So that's essentially how it kind of broke down. So the Treaty of Versailles is going to be accepted. And we could see all the provisions that are going to come from there. Now, with all of these things going on, we know that there is going to be... we're going to look at these cartoons. We're going to look at these in class instead. But I want to show you some of the map changes to the map of Europe as a result of World War One. You can see, obviously, from the map, Germany on the left side you have prior to World War One. On the right side you see after World War One. And the major difference I want you to see is that you have Germany lost so much territory, as did Russia. You can see where Germany is going to lose this area, which is going to become Poland. And we could see that Russia is going to lose this area up here and this area up here, and they're going to lose a little bit down here. So Russia loses a lot for leaving the war early. Germany is going to lose this area over here. They're going to lose a lot of territory. They're going to lose Alsace and Lorraine over here. But we can also see that Austria-Hungary is going to completely collapse. And it's going to be made up into these different states based on ethnicity. You're going to have the creation of Austria as a country, Hungary as a country, and Czechoslovakia as a country, all based on nationalist ideas. Yugoslavia, where we know the World War I began, is going to be a nation that's going to be created for the Slavic people. And you can see the creation of these other nations. The one area that wasn't really affected at all was Italy, and they were not happy about it because the Italians kind of were like, we should get something for the war, which eventually is going to cause them to be angry, and they're going to want revenge as well. So there you go. Germany and Italy are going to have a little alliance in World War II. Not to ruin the story. So you could see the change in the map of Europe. Lastly, the Middle East. And I want to show you this as a comparison because as these great empires in Europe broke up, like Austria-Hungary and the Germanic Empire, those areas that were formed were allowed to be independent and they were allowed to govern themselves. When the Ottoman Empire collapses at the end of World War I, those areas that were once the Ottoman Empire, with the exception of a couple of them, they are going to be called they're going to become parts of the European imperialism. And they're going to create, Europe is going to create something called the mandate system through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The mandate system is going to carve up part of the Middle East into almost like temporary colonies that are going to be, the Europeans are going to have indirect rule over these areas, and they're going to control the map of the Middle East, which is kind of an interesting idea. Whereas in Europe, they were given independence. In the Middle East, what's going to happen is that they're going to become parts of the Europeans. In other words, this is kind of like a little bit of a disrespect towards the Middle Easterners. Okay? So I want you guys to keep in that in mind. When the Ottoman Empire collapses, you're going to have the creation of a new colonial system in the Middle East. Okay? And I think that's all we're going to do for tonight. I hope you got something out of the video.